It's always so great to be in a room of legal professionals. You guys are sort of at the peak of smarts and good looks, so it's an honor to be here. So I want to give you a little bit of context for the research that I was doing that I'm going to talk to you about. So this was a report that I looked at why there's a racial gap in support for punitive policies. So we know that there are racial disparities in criminal justice outcomes, but I think that less well studied and understood is that there's also a racial gap in support for harsh criminal justice policies. So if you ask Americans whether or not they support the death sentence, that's where you see the most extreme divide, where the majority of African Americans do not support the death penalty, and the majority of white Americans do support it, and Hispanics are in the middle. They're sort of evenly split on the issue. So that's with the death penalty. You also see it with other kinds of sanctions as well. So with support for three strikes laws, with the issue of trying juveniles as adults, having harsher courts. When you ask people about these other issues, then you see that actually the majority of Americans support more punitive policies, but there's still a racial gap, with white Americans being more likely to support these harsh sanctions. And so the question is, why is that, given that African Americans and Hispanics are more likely to be victims of crime? So if you look at homicide rates and other kinds of crimes, people of color are more likely to be affected objectively. Also, if you ask people how concerned they are about these kinds of crimes, people of color are also just more likely to express that they think about it a lot. They alter their patterns of walking and activities in response to fear of crime. So why would it be that the segment of our population that's actually safer and that actually feels safer is more supportive of harsh criminal justice policies? And so there are many parts of the answer to this, but I think that part of it has to do with, a major part of it has to do with racial associations of crime, and the fact that whites associate crime disproportionately with people of color beyond actual crime rates. And researchers have shown that the more whites associate crime with people of color, they're actually even more likely to support harsh criminal justice policies. And the reason for this is lack of empathy. So when people think that crime is committed by others like them, they're more likely to support preventative policies. They're less likely to want to throw the book at somebody. But when the person that, in your mind, if the person that's committing crime is very different from you, it's harder to understand the roots of what's going on, the roots of the problem, and it's easier to decide to be extremely punitive. So how do we know that white Americans have strong racial associations of crime? So there are many ways to measure this. You can ask people directly, what proportion of violent crime do you think is committed by African Americans or Hispanics? What proportion of burglaries and so on? And when researchers ask people this and they compare the percentage that people give, the people's estimates, it's higher than actual arrest rates for whatever level of reliability arrest rates are for actual crime rates. You can also look at implicit association tests. So when researchers have people sit in a sort of, you can also do these tests yourself. If you Google implicit association tests, you'll see that most Americans, white and people of color, but especially among whites, even if you think that you support goals of racial equality, you're likely to show in these tests that measure indirectly your racial associations of crime, you're likely to show bias. So for example, some of these tests will show a picture to you and then will show you words that are positive or negative and ask you to classify whether the word's positive or negative. And when researchers do this, when people do these tests, researchers find that people are more likely to misclassify words or take longer to classify a positive word as a positive word if it's shown with next to an image of a person of color. There are also simulated shooter studies where you look at a picture and you have to quickly decide, is a person in this picture holding a weapon or are they holding a different kind of object like a soda bottle? And when researchers have, when regular people, especially college students, do these tests a lot for their professors, but you can, like I said, do this test yourself online. And police officers have done these tests as well. Researchers have found that, especially among the general public, they're more likely to misidentify just a regular object as a weapon if it's held by a person of color. It also takes them longer to correctly identify just a regular object as such if it's held by a person of color. When these studies have been done with police officers have better accuracy, but they take longer to reach the correct conclusion when it's a person of color shown to them. So the question is, where do these racial associations of crime come from? And there are many possible answers. If people were to actually just have an assessment of who's in the prison system, who's incarcerated, they would understand that about almost two-thirds of the prison population are people of color. So if that were to be their source of information on who commits crime in our country, that's very much disproportionate to the general population, which is about 30%. So, it's not clear, though, how much people actually are aware of the demographics of the prison population. There's also another possibility is that maybe people are aware of actual crime rates. So how much does that shape things? Well, if you actually look at crime rates, it is the case that for violent crimes are disproportionately committed by people of color who are more likely to live in concentrated urban poverty. But that's not true with other kinds of crime, like drug sales. And yet people the researchers have shown that people of all races use drugs at similar rates. People also generally buy drugs from people of the same race and ethnicity as them. And so then that would suggest that our people that are in the justice system for drug use and sales should represent the general population. But as you know, there's a great deal of racial disparity there. But another major component of it is the topic of our panel today, which is media and the kinds of images that we're saturated with when we look to evening news, but not just there, even in newspapers, and really quite respectable papers as well. And so the problem that we run into there is the same kinds of implicit biases that regular people have, where they mean well, but their work produces biased outcomes. Appears also within the ranks of reporters and producers, and of course also appears within the world of criminal justice professionals, not just prosecutors, but also public defenders or defense attorneys whose racial perceptions of crime shape how the kind of triaging that they do with their work. So this is a ubiquitous issue. And so studies that have documented this kind of these disparities in media coverage have shown that, well, first of all, there's just a lot of crime coverage in the news, in particular on television. So there's the adage, if it bleeds, it leads. And so this contributes to people thinking that there's actually a lot more crime than there is. So if you ask Americans now, do you think crime rates are lower now than the previous year? For the last several decades, majority of Americans say yes, crime rates are higher than the previous year. The number, it's like 68% now say this, and it used to be even higher. It used to be about 80-something% would say that. What's curious is that we've been in a period of significantly reduced crime rates. So homicide rate is half what it used to be 20 years ago. And homicide is sort of the best indicator of how safe our communities are. And yet the majority of Americans continue to think that crime is getting worse, even though every year crime's actually getting better in our communities. So there's that issue, but there's also the question of, if it bleeds, it leads doesn't quite capture it because not everyone's blood gets equal attention. So in particular, there tends to be, so for example, we can start with homicide. Most homicides are intraracial crimes. So white Americans tend to kill other white Americans, black Americans kill other black Americans. And there are disproportionate levels of black victimization. And yet that's generally not the kind of victim that we see when in crime coverage. The victim that we're more likely to see, or disproportionately gets a lot of attention, is is when it's a white victim, and in particular when it's a white woman who's been victimized. So Richard Lundman did a study of a Columbus, Ohio newspaper, and he found that, well, he was asking, what determines newsworthiness? Why is it that this is the population that's disproportionately represented in this newspaper's coverage? And so he thought, well, is it that these kinds of crimes, and what he found was that it was white female victims that were victimized by African American men. This was a population that was disproportionately represented in newspaper coverage of crime. So he asked, well, is it that these cases are just so strange and anomalous? Is that why there's so much attention on these kinds of cases? And that's not true, because actually the most unusual cases, if newspapers were just going for novelty, would be cases where white men have killed white women, or there are other variations that are much less common. And these are certainly not the most common and most representative types of crimes. And so this raises an issue in that white Americans, and just Americans in general, reading these kinds of newspapers, most newspapers, it's a disservice to them because it underrepresents how often African Americans are victims of crime, and it overrepresents how often whites are victims of crime committed by people of color. And so the way he described it is that newsworthiness seems to be scripted using stereotypes grounded in white racism and white fear of black crime. So that's sort of quantitative differences in representation of crime. There's also much more subtle qualitative differences as well. So when researchers have looked closely at representation in TV news, they found that when suspects are portrayed in TV news, that if it's a person of color who's a suspect, they're more likely to be left unnamed. And so then you just get this like generalizable fear of individuals of color as potential suspects. They're more likely to be shown in police custody, whereas a white suspect is likely to be just shown independently, not dressed in whatever he or she was wearing in jail, or not shown with a mugshot. And so these are some more subtle disparities in how crime coverage happens, and that contribute to our racial perceptions of crime. So what can be done? First, I want to start with the good news. So the good news is that the public is actually much less punitive than it had been in the past. So when Mark Ramirez, who's a professor at Arizona State, he compiles a measure of public punitiveness, and he looks at what percentage of Americans support the death penalty, what percentage support 3 strikes and you're outlaws, harsher policing. And what he's found is that support for these harsh policies increased as crime rates increased, and they've decreased if crime rates have gone down. What we don't see yet is a similar decrease in the prison population that matches either the reduction in crime rates or public support for scaling back harsh policies. So something that reporters especially can do is to educate policymakers about this shift. And the researchers have actually shown that when you ask policymakers, well, when you ask them how much support they think there is for harsh criminal justice policies, they exaggerate it. They have an exaggerated sense of what the public would actually like. So things that reporters and producers can do to address the kind of exaggerated coverage and disparities that I was describing. So Lori Dorfman and Vincent Schiraldi have a great report where they talk about the importance of media outlets actually monitoring and measuring the work that they're doing to compare it to crime rates, to actually have an assessment of the broader trends in crime rates, so that when a couple of high-profile incidents happen, they don't give people the sense of a crime wave. And we've seen some really troubling coverage of the recent crime wave that has happened over the summer in some cities. So in terms of racial disparities, it's really important to be very explicit about measuring and monitoring the kinds of coverage that people are producing and comparing it to the local crime rates in the area that the outlet is covering. And also not just the quantity, but also the differences in the quality of the coverage as well. So in terms of what is the person being named, what is the person wearing, are they shown in custody, and so on. And so more generally for, how to address the kinds of implicit biases that I was describing, not just for news producers, but also just more broadly, including in criminal justice settings, the more awareness that people have of race, the more it's on their radar. Researchers have found that the more likely they are to try to account for and hold back their biases. So if you have the impression that, well, I'm a social justice person, and I'm all about equal rights and so on. So I don't really need to worry about this. Like, that's the kind of person that needs to be most cautious about the work that they're producing. I think that a lot of times we think that what we really need to do to weed out racial inequality in the system, and more generally in our society, is to weed out the racists, the people that are sending really nasty emails, like the kind that got uncovered when digging deeper into Ferguson. But there are actually, I think, in professional environments, very few people that are like that you can identify with having those kinds of views. There are actually, on the other hand, a lot more people that think that they're doing the right thing. And when you actually look at their work, when you measure the outcomes and look for the disparities, you find a great deal of disparities. And so to the extent that people are willing to look for it and implement change, then we can have some hope. So for example, Vera Institute of Justice has been working with a number of district attorney's offices, like in Milwaukee and in Manhattan, and looking at disparities and how prosecutors are charging whites versus people of color. And so, for example, in Milwaukee, they found a great deal of disparity in charging for drug paraphernalia. And having identified it, then the office was able to actually implement changes in their charging policies to eliminate that particular disparity. So that's what we need more of.